We must advance the troops along this axis, securing the bridgehead by nightfall.
Imagine a dictator who, every time a battle went wrong, didn't fix the plan, he fired the planner. Every setback wasn't a lesson, it was a personal insult. Every disagreement wasn't strategy, it was treason. That was Hitler's command philosophy by the middle of World War II. The man who had once let professionals run his armies had turned on them. What began as a political takeover became a slow decapitation of Germany's own military brain. Before we begin, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian, where we break down the worst decisions that changed the course of history. When the war began in 1939, the German officer corps was still largely independent. Men like Guderian, Manstein, Rundstedt, and Rommel had been trained professionals career soldiers who understood logistics, timing, and tactics better than anyone in Europe. They had studied the failures of World War I, built modern doctrines like Blitzkrieg, and in the early years of the war, they executed those doctrines perfectly. Their planning led to stunning victories. Poland in weeks, France in 6. Hitler basked in their success, but he didn't share it. He began to believe that victory came not from strategy, but from his own genius. At first, Hitler listened to his generals. He trusted their experience, even if reluctantly. But after the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, that relationship collapsed. The Eastern Front was vast, unpredictable, and brutal. When the initial blitz failed to break the Red Army, the war turned into a test of endurance. And Hitler didn't have the patience for endurance. He wanted results. When those results didn't come, he blamed everyone but himself. In his mind, the defeats weren't the product of overreach, supply shortages, or whether they were proof that his generals were cowards. He accused them of lacking faith in victory. The officers who questioned his impossible orders became suspects, and the ones who obeyed without question became favorites. Over time, the German high command shifted from a council of professionals to a chorus of yes men. This wasn't a single event, but a long purge that took place over several years. The first cracks appeared during the winter of 1941, when the German advance on Moscow collapsed under snow and Soviet counterattacks. Generals like Heinz Guderian, the architect of Blitzkrieg, warned Hitler that the army needed to withdraw to avoid encirclement. He was right, Hitler refused. When Guderian protested, he was fired. In Hitler's mind, retreat was weakness, and any general who mentioned it was a traitor. It became a pattern. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, another experienced commander, urged caution on the Eastern Front and was dismissed for defeatism. Erich von Manstein, one of the sharpest minds in the Wehrmacht, repeatedly clashed with Hitler over strategy. He too was eventually removed. Even Rommel, once Hitler's favorite, fell from grace when he began to question the Führer S orders in North Africa. The message was clear: obedience mattered more than ability. By 1943, the German high command had been hollowed out. The men who remained weren't the best. They were the most agreeable. Hitler surrounded himself with officers who echoed his delusions. They fed him reports of success while the front lines burned. He wanted loyalty, not competence. And loyalty was exactly what he got: blind, unconditional, and useless. The professional soldiers understood what was happening. Many of them had spent decades studying warfare. They knew that wars weren't won by willpower or ideology, but by logistics, planning, and timing. They tried to warn him about supply shortages, overextension, and the reality of Soviet industrial power. But every warning sounded like criticism, and Hitler didn't tolerate criticism. He once told his generals, "I am the greatest military genius of all time." It wasn't arrogance, it was delusion. He believed his instincts were better than their experience. Every time he overruled them and something worked, it reinforced that belief. When it didn't, he blamed them. He had rewritten the rules of command so that every success was his and every failure was theirs. It was a system that could only end in collapse. The irony is that Hitler's early victories had depended entirely on the very people he would later destroy. The campaigns in Poland and France weren't his creations. They were planned and executed by the same generals he would accuse of betrayal. But as the war grew harder, he became convinced that professional soldiers were too cautious, too slow, too old-fashioned. He saw their restraint as weakness and their analysis as doubt. To him, the only real weapon was willpower, the belief that sheer determination could override logic. That belief seeped into every level of command. Orders became more reckless. Counterattacks were launched with no fuel, no ammunition, no plan, only the instruction to hold at all costs. Units were wiped out obeying orders that made no sense. Entire divisions froze to death because Hitler refused to let them retreat. The generals who tried to intervene were either ignored or dismissed. The Wehrmacht, once known for its precision, became a blunt instrument. The purges reached their height after the disasters of Stalingrad and Kursk. These defeats shattered Germany's military credibility, but instead of reforming his command, Hitler doubled down. He replaced his senior officers with men like Wilhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl, figures whose main qualification was obedience. They existed not to advise him, but to agree with him. Keitel was so subservient that the other generals nicknamed him Leichitl, a play on the German word for the nodder. The shift from professionalism to obedience destroyed the chain of command. Hitler took direct control of operational decisions, issuing orders from his bunker hundreds of miles from the front. He moved divisions on maps without understanding terrain, weather, or logistics. He micromanaged every battle from the siege of Leningrad to the defense of Normandy based on instinct rather than information. His staff became glorified secretaries, writing down his fantasies as if they were plans. The officers who survived learned to adapt. They no longer gave advice, they gave affirmation. They told him what he wanted to hear, that victory was still possible, that morale was high, that the Soviets were about to collapse. It was the only way to keep their positions and their lives. Those who didn't play along were replaced or quietly sidelined. The result was an army that looked unified on paper but was rotting from within. The loss of professional dissent had consequences far beyond strategy. It destroyed morale among the soldiers who actually fought the war. Frontline troops knew when orders were suicidal. They watched entire battalions thrown into hopeless assaults because their superiors were afraid to contradict Hitler's commands. The army that had once been feared for its discipline and coordination became chaotic, led by fear instead of skill. This pattern of self-destruction defined Hitler's final years as commander-in-chief. The more the war turned against him, the more he tightened his grip. He replaced experience with flattery, strategy with slogans, and analysis with ideology. What began as a military machine built on efficiency became a cult of personality built on denial. By purging his generals, Hitler didn't just weaken his army, he removed the only people who could tell him the truth. He isolated himself inside an echo chamber where everything was filtered through loyalty. The men around him stopped thinking, stopped questioning, stopped warning him. He had turned his command structure into a mirror that reflected only his own ego. In 1941, the Wehrmacht was the strongest army in the world. By 1944, it was an extension of one man's paranoia. The purge of the high command wasn't a side effect of the war, it was one of its central causes of defeat. Hitler's distrust of competence became Germany's undoing. And as the Eastern Front collapsed, as the Soviets pushed toward Berlin and the Western Allies landed in France, the dictator, who had once ruled through fear and charisma, was now ruling through delusion. He had fired his best and kept his worst, and in doing so, he had cut off his own head. Hitler's purge of the German officer corps didn't just weaken his command structure, erased the country's military brain. Men who had built Germany's war machine were replaced by flatterers who existed to agree with him. It was a deliberate act of sabotage disguised as leadership. What Hitler called cleansing was, in truth, an annihilation of competence. After 1941, the chain reaction of firings and forced retirements grew relentless. Field Marshal Walther von Brauchitsch, who had served as commander-in-chief of the army, was one of the first major casualties. He had tried to maintain professional independence within the army's hierarchy, often mediating between Hitler's reckless impulses and the realities of war. When he objected to Hitler's direct interference in operations, he was dismissed. Hitler immediately assumed personal command of the army, a decision that guaranteed every subsequent mistake would come from him alone. Replacing Brauchitsch didn't make the army more efficient, it made it obedient. The officers who followed weren't chosen for strategic vision, they were chosen for silence. Men like Wilhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl rose to prominence not because of brilliance, but because they agreed with everything Hitler said. They became extensions of his will, bureaucrats in uniform whose job was to nod and obey. Keitel, in particular, embodied the rot spreading through the upper ranks. Once a competent staff officer, he was transformed into a yes-man so pliant that his peers mocked him behind his back. They called him Keitel, the nodding donkey. The problem wasn't a T. Simply that Hitler replaced smart men with mediocre ones. It was that he dismantled the very culture of military argument. The Wehrmacht had been built on a doctrine called Auftragstaktik, or mission command, which emphasized initiative, flexibility, and independent thought among officers. Commanders were trained to adapt to changing conditions, not just to follow orders. Hitler destroyed that tradition. He centralized decision-making in himself, turning once innovative officers into mechanical executors of his fantasies. This new system meant that bad ideas were no longer filtered out, they were amplified. When Hitler ordered no retreat during the winter battles on the Eastern Front, there was no one left with the authority or courage to tell him that such an order was suicidal. Stalingrad became the ultimate example of what happens when obedience replaces reason. By late 1942, General Friedrich Paulus and his Sixth Army were encircled in the city. His staff begged for permission to break out while there was still time. Every logistical report, every radio message, every piece of evidence pointed to disaster if they stayed. But Hitler forbade retreat. He insisted that holding Stalingrad was a matter of willpower, not supply lines. Paulus, trapped by loyalty and fear, obeyed. Over 250,000 men were lost. It was a defeat so immense that it shattered Germany's offensive power forever. The tragedy of Stalingrad was not just in its losses, it was in how preventable it was. The professional commanders who could have argued for retreat, Guderian, Manstein, Brocic, were already gone or powerless. Their replacements didn't dare question the Führer. The system that had once produced the most innovative army in Europe had been reduced to an echo chamber of delusion. The same pattern appeared months earlier during Operation Barbarossa, when Hitler diverted crucial armored divisions from the drive on Moscow to seize Ukraine. His generals warned him that splitting forces would waste momentum, but Hitler wanted symbolic victories. He believed that capturing Kiev and the southern oil fields would prove his strategic genius. It was a fatal error. The diversion delayed the advance just long enough for the Russian winter to set in, trapping German troops without proper supplies or gear. The offensive stalled, and with it, Germany's last chance to win the war quickly. Each mistake fed Hitler's paranoia. Each setback convinced him that he alone understood how to win. The result was a downward spiral where every correction was punished, every warning dismissed, and every success claimed as his own. He didn't want generals, he wanted worshippers. Those who stayed learned to survive by adaptation. They learned to phrase criticism as flattery, to disguise disagreement as obedience. When Hitler demanded impossible offensives, they reworded their reports to sound optimistic. They became political survivors rather than military leaders. The German High Command turned from a council of warriors into a court of courtiers. The sidelining of strategic genius didn't just cripple operations, it killed initiative across the ranks. Officers in the field, once trusted to act on their judgment, now feared deviating from orders, even when those orders made no sense. Tactical flexibility, the key to early blitzkrieg victories, was gone. Hitler's obsession with control had replaced adaptability with paralysis. This loss of independent thought extended even to the design of military campaigns. Manstein's plan for a flexible defensive strategy on the Eastern Front, which might have preserved Germany's strength for years, was rejected outright. Hitler preferred to hold every inch of ground, no matter how meaningless. When Manstein proposed counterattacks based on mobility and timing, Hitler dismissed him for defeatist thinking. When Guderian suggested regrouping panzer units to restore mobility, he was accused of insubordination. Every great strategist in the Wehrmacht eventually reached the same conclusion. Their leader was no longer rational. Hitler's orders came not from calculation but emotion. He planned campaigns to prove points, not to win wars. The generals who might have balanced that impulse were gone, and those who remained lacked the authority to stop him. The results were predictable. Germany's military machine became a top-heavy structure that no longer learned from its own mistakes. Every failure was repeated on a larger scale. No retreat at Stalingrad became no surrender in Italy. Hold fast in Normandy and fight to the last man in Berlin. It wasn't strategy, Was suicide codified into policy? At the heart of it all was a single, fatal flaw. Hitler didn't understand that leadership requires opposition. A competent leader surrounds himself with people who can disagree, who can warn him when he's wrong. Hitler surrounded himself with mirrors. He wanted reflection, not resistance. The result was a war waged on fantasy, sustained by fear, and doomed by obedience. As his empire began to crumble, the generals he had dismissed watched from the sidelines, helpless. They saw the consequences of the system they had once served. They knew the war could no longer be won, yet Hitler still ordered offensives that existed only on paper. His maps became delusions of power, his commands declarations of denial. By 1943, the pattern was irreversible. The generals who remained men like Keitel, Jodl, and Zeitzler were technically competent but strategically irrelevant. They existed to give Hitler's orders the illusion of legitimacy. Their job wasn't to win battles. It was to write down failure in a way that looked like victory. The purge of Germany's strategic minds was not just an act of arrogance, it was an act of self-destruction. By firing the best and keeping the worst, Hitler ensured that the only voice left in the room was his own. The disasters that followed weren't accidents of fate. They were the logical outcome of a system that had silenced reason. The war that began with lightning speed now dragged on in slow motion, every battle dictated by a man who refused to listen. The professionals who might have saved the army were gone. The yes-men who replaced them had nothing to offer but obedience. And in the ruins of their silence, Germany's fate was sealed long before the final shots were fired. By late 1941, Hitler had completed his transformation from political leader to self-declared supreme commander. The dismissals, the firings, and the quiet sidelining of professionals had reached their logical end. There was no one left to challenge him. The army that had once been guided by some of the best military minds in Europe was now being run by a man whose only real combat experience was as a corporal in the trenches of the First World War. What followed was the formal centralization of incompetence. When Walther von Brauchitsch was dismissed as commander-in-chief, Hitler didn't appoint a replacement. He appointed himself. It was the ultimate consolidation of control, the point at which he became his own general staff, his own strategist, and his own field commander. What he lacked in training, he made up for with arrogance. In his mind, the generals had failed him. Their caution, their professionalism, their cowardice, as he called it, had kept him from achieving total victory. So he removed them from the equation entirely. The new system revolved around a single Ruhmeshauptquartier, or Führer headquarters where Hitler spent his days poring over maps. The war was now conducted not on the battlefield, but across tables covered in colored pins and lines. From hundreds of miles away, he issued commands that moved armies he couldn't see. Across terrain he didn't understand. He believed that by studying the maps long enough, he could see patterns invisible to his generals. In reality, he was gambling lives based on incomplete reports and intuition. This was no longer strategy. It was micromanagement, on a scale no modern army had ever seen. Hitler interfered in every operational detail, dictating where divisions should move, when they should attack, when they could withdraw. He ignored field intelligence and refused to believe reports that contradicted his assumptions. If the front collapsed, he accused his commanders of disloyalty. If a unit held its ground, he claimed credit. The men who had once been free to adapt and respond to real-time conditions were now shackled to the whims of a man detached from reality. His command method reflected his psychology. He trusted no one but himself, and his paranoia had turned the German high command into a system of isolation. Orders flowed down from the top, but information never flowed back up. Generals at the front were afraid to speak honestly. Reports were rewritten to sound positive before reaching him. The truth became filtered through layers of fear until it reached Hitler as fiction. He fought not the war that existed, but the war he wanted to believe in. This centralization wasn't just a bad idea, it was a catastrophe waiting to happen. The sheer scale of the Eastern Front made centralized control impossible. The distances were too vast, the logistics too complex, and the conditions too unpredictable for one man sitting in a bunker to coordinate effectively. Hitler's obsession with absolute authority created bottlenecks that paralyzed operations. Simple tactical decisions like shifting a division or approving a retreat had to wait for approval from Berlin. By the time his orders arrived, the situation on the ground had already changed. The results were devastating. Units were encircled because Hitler refused to authorize withdrawals. Reinforcements were delayed because he wouldn't delegate transportation priorities. Supplies piled up in the wrong sectors, while starving divisions froze in the snow. His insistence on controlling everything from headquarters turned the army into a bureaucracy of failure. The machine that had once functioned with mechanical precision was now staggering under the weight of its own command structure. The contrast with the Allies was stark. The British and Americans had professional general staffs that allowed flexibility. Commanders like Eisenhower and Montgomery made decisions based on intelligence, not ideology. They delegated authority and coordinated across fronts. Even the Soviets, who began the war with rigid centralization, learned from their mistakes. By 1943, they allowed local commanders to make tactical calls. Germany moved in the opposite direction, devolving from efficiency into chaos because its leader refused to share control. Hitler's delusions of genius became increasingly apparent in his daily routines. He would spend hours lecturing his generals about tactics he barely understood, quoting lines from World War I manuals as if they were revelations. He saw himself as a master strategist, yet his ideas often ignored logistics, weather, and supply. He believed that willpower alone could overcome material disadvantage. When generals tried to explain that tanks needed fuel or that infantry couldn't T-hold positions without ammunition, he accused them of defeatism. The tragedy was that some of these generals had the experience to save Germany from total collapse. Men like Guderian and Manstein understood modern warfare at a level Hitler never could. They had studied maneuver warfare, mobility, and the integration of air and ground forces. They saw the importance of flexibility. But under Hitler's system, flexibility was treason. Orders were to be obeyed exactly as written, no matter the consequences. The most infamous example of this was the no-retreat doctrine. Beginning in 1942, Hitler ordered that no German unit was to withdraw under any circumstances. The logic, in his mind, was that retreat invited panic, and panic led to collapse. He believed that holding every position, even when surrounded, would break the enemy's will. In practice, it annihilated entire armies. Encircled divisions that could have escaped were trapped and destroyed. Tens of thousands of men froze to death in the snow because one man, as pride, mattered more than their survival. As the defeats mounted, Hitler's headquarters became more detached from reality. He surrounded himself with subordinates who reinforced his illusions. Keitel and Jodl acted less as military advisors and more as enablers. They translated Hitler's fantasies into formal orders, dressing madness in the language of strategy. They flattered him by calling his instincts divine intuition. Meanwhile, the generals in the field, those still capable of independent thought, were silenced or dismissed. By the time of the Stalingrad disaster, Hitler's command structure had become a self-contained loop of incompetence. The men in charge of planning couldn't question him, and those who could see the truth weren't allowed near him. When the Sixth Army was surrounded, Hitler's response was not to adapt, but to double down. He sent radio messages promising imaginary relief forces and ordered Paulus to fight to the last man. It was delusion turned policy, and it cost 250,000 lives. What made this centralization uniquely disastrous was the way it inverted the logic of command. In a normal army, higher leadership provides direction, while field officers make tactical adjustments. In Hitler's army, the situation was reversed. Strategic decisions were made at the top, and tactical ones were dictated from afar. The generals became messengers instead of leaders. Every layer of the hierarchy lost initiative. The chain of command was no longer a network, it was a straight line ending at a bunker in East Prussia. Hitler's control reached absurd levels. He would personally select which divisions should receive replacements, which units should rest, and which should attack. He tracked fuel allocations to individual regiments. He meddled in the deployment of single tank battalions. His orders were often contradictory, driven by emotion rather than reason. One day he demanded total offensives. The next he demanded fortifications and defensive lines. The generals stopped planning, they simply waited for his next outburst. This environment fostered a strange form of paralysis. Officers at every level learned that initiative could get them fired or worse. They stopped taking risks, even when those risks could save thousands of lives. Innovation disappeared. The Wehrmacht, once a model of tactical creativity, became rigid and predictable. Its defeat was no longer a question of if, but when. The deeper Hitler entrenched himself in his role as supreme commander, the more catastrophic his decisions became. His lack of formal military education wasn't the problem, it was his refusal to learn. He had no understanding of modern logistics, of how fuel, railways, and manpower determined the outcome of campaigns. He thought in abstract symbols lines on maps, arrows, and circles, while the reality behind those lines was starvation, exhaustion, and death. What made it worse was that Hitler genuinely believed his interference was saving Germany. In his mind, the generals were cowards who lacked the nerve to win. His constant micromanagement was proof of his commitment, not his incompetence. Every time his orders failed, he blamed others. Every time they succeeded, he took the credit. The entire system revolved around protecting his ego, not protecting the nation. By centralizing command, Hitler didn't make the army stronger, he made it blind. He transformed one of the most sophisticated military organizations in history into an obedient machine that followed commands it knew were wrong. The generals became actors in a performance where truth was forbidden and the only script was obedience. From his map room in East Prussia, Hitler directed the largest war in history with the confidence of a man who thought instinct could replace intelligence. But instinct cannot replace knowledge, and willpower cannot replace strategy. His empire was now led by a man fighting shadows on a map, making decisions based on pride rather than reality. And as the Eastern Front burned, the German army marched deeper into disaster, one order at a time. By the time Hitler had taken full control of military operations, the German High Command was no longer an organization that planned wars. It was one that survived them. The officer corps, once the intellectual core of the Wehrmacht, had been stripped of its independence and its dignity. Fear had replaced strategy as the driving force behind decisions. Generals no longer asked, "What is the best move?" They asked, "What will keep me alive?" This atmosphere didn't emerge overnight. It was the slow, corrosive product of years of purges, humiliation, and paranoia. Every dismissal sent a clear message. Disagreement was dangerous. The generals who had once debated strategy around conference tables now whispered their doubts in private, careful never to let their hesitation show in Hitler's presence. The price of honesty was career death, or sometimes literal death. The result was an army that still looked formidable on paper, but had lost its ability to think. Field reports from this period reveal how pervasive the fear had become. Commanders would delay sending bad news to headquarters, rewriting situation updates to make them sound less dire. Divisions that were collapsing were described as holding with determination. Defeats were labeled temporary tactical withdrawals. Hitler wanted reports of success, so that's what he got. The entire chain of command became a system of self-deception. No one wanted to be the messenger who brought bad news to the Führer. At the heart of this culture was the growing terror of being branded defeatist. The label was as fatal as treason. To be accused of defeatism meant more than losing your command. It meant losing your reputation, your freedom, sometimes even your life. Hitler's fury toward anyone who suggested retreat was well known. During meetings, when an officer proposed pulling back to save men or equipment, Hitler would explode into rants about cowardice and betrayal. He saw tactical withdrawals as personal insults, proof that his generals didn't share his faith in final victory. The consequences were immediate and deadly. Generals stopped giving real advice. They stopped offering analysis, predictions, or alternate plans. Instead, they echoed whatever Hitler said. If he wanted an attack, they planned one. If he demanded a defensive stand, they promised to hold. They had learned the hard way that logic didn't matter. Loyalty did. This obedience had nothing to do with belief in the cause. It was survival instinct. In Hitler's Germany, silence was safety. The fear wasn't just psychological, it was institutional. The Gestapo and the SS had infiltrated the military hierarchy. Officers suspected of disloyalty were watched, reported, and sometimes executed. Even casual remarks among colleagues could lead to denunciation. The army was no longer a professional brotherhood. It was a network of suspicion. Every man wondered who might be listening. Every conversation was filtered through the question, could this get me killed? Frontline commanders bore the heaviest burden. They were trapped between two realities: the battlefield, where logic dictated caution, and headquarters, where logic was treason. A general who ordered a retreat to save his men risked execution for disobedience. A general who obeyed and stayed risked annihilation. Either way, he lost. Many chose the second option, sacrificing entire divisions rather than their careers. They sent men into hopeless battles, because the greater danger came not from the enemy, but from their own leader. The effect on morale was devastating. Soldiers could sense the paralysis above them. They watched as orders grew more absurd, as positions were held long after they should have been abandoned, as reinforcements never arrived because no one dared to admit they were needed. The front became a graveyard of discipline and logic. Officers who had once embodied professionalism now executed suicidal directives without question. The German army's famed efficiency had become mechanical obedience. One of the clearest examples of this collapse came during the retreat from the Dnieper River in 1943. Soviet pressure was overwhelming, and every field report urged a withdrawal to avoid encirclement. Hitler refused. He ordered the army to hold its ground, declaring that any retreat would invite catastrophe. The catastrophe came anyway. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were trapped, and the line had to be abandoned under far worse conditions than if it had been done earlier. No general dared say, "I told you so." The survivors understood that honesty had no place in Hitler's army. This fear-driven paralysis reached its peak in 1944 after the failed July 20th assassination attempt on Hitler. The event confirmed his worst suspicions that even among his officers, loyalty was conditional. His response was another wave of purges, arrests, and executions. Nearly 200 officers were implicated, some guilty, most not. Many were hanged with piano wire in slow public executions meant to terrify anyone who might think independently. After that, the last traces of professional dissent vanished. The High Command became a hollow institution of frightened men performing rituals of obedience. The contrast with the early war years was staggering. In 1939 and 1940, generals like Guderian and Manstein had acted with initiative, sometimes bending orders to seize opportunities. Their flexibility had been Germany's greatest advantage. By 1944, that spirit was gone. Every decision required approval from Hitler himself, and every deviation from his instructions carried mortal risk. The commanders who might have saved divisions through adaptive thinking no longer existed. They had either been fired or learned to stop thinking altogether. The new generation of officers, promoted for loyalty rather than talent, perpetuated the culture of fear. They modeled their leadership not on competence but on submission. They copied Hitler's language, his aggression, his obsession with holding ground. The word retreat became taboo. Soldiers were ordered to die where they stood because their superiors were too frightened to authorize withdrawals. The battlefield became a series of last stands, each one more futile than the last. This breakdown in trust also poisoned communication between the front and headquarters. Intelligence reports were falsified to fit Hitler's expectations. Successes were exaggerated, losses underreported. Commanders exaggerated troop strength to avoid accusations of weakness. The army began fighting a phantom war, a war where the numbers on Hitler's maps bore no resemblance to the reality on the ground. The Führer's orders were executed not because they were wise, but because they were unavoidable. Even in private, the fear was suffocating. Officers who knew the war was lost could only confide in a handful of trusted friends, if at all. The slightest sign of defeatism, a sigh, a grim remark, a gesture of resignation, could be enough to trigger suspicion. Men who had fought side by side for decades began to doubt each other. The army's cohesion, once its greatest strength, dissolved under the constant threat of internal persecution. The tragic irony is that this atmosphere of terror ensured the war lasted far longer than it should have. Rational command would have sought to preserve lives and consolidate defenses. Hitler's fear-based leadership did the opposite. He preferred destruction to compromise. When generals hesitated, he replaced them. When cities were surrounded, he ordered them to fight to the death. When entire armies were collapsing, he accused them of betrayal. Every military loss became another excuse to tighten control, to make obedience even more absolute. By 1945, the German army wasn't functioning as a military institution at all. It was an instrument of Hitler's ego, a mechanism designed to prolong his illusion of power. Generals who should have been strategists became administrators of despair, managing death rather than preventing it. Their loyalty, once rooted in professionalism, had become a form of fear-induced paralysis. In the end, the culture of fear achieved exactly what Hitler's enemies could not. It destroyed the Wehrmacht from within. It stripped it of initiative, of honesty, and of the human capacity to think under pressure. Every decision made under that regime carried the weight of terror. Generals fought not for victory, but for survival, not against the Allies, but against their own leader's wrath. What had once been a disciplined army became a collection of frightened men, obeying impossible orders from a bunker hundreds of miles away. The fear that Hitler had cultivated as a tool of control became the very force that ensured his defeat. In destroying trust, he destroyed command. In silencing his generals, he silenced strategy. The war no longer belonged to professionals, it belonged to fear. In the end, Hitler's purge of his own generals wasn't just a series of firing zit, was a surgical removal of his army's brain. It was the moment when Germany's greatest strength, its professional military tradition, was turned into its greatest weakness. What began as an assertion of control became a self-inflicted wound so deep that the Wehrmacht never recovered. The dictator who demanded loyalty above competence destroyed the very institution that could have saved him. Before we begin, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian, where we break down how history's worst leaders made their own defeats inevitable. By 1944, the damage was complete. The army that had once terrified Europe was now stumbling from defeat to defeat, led by men too frightened or too unqualified to act independently. The Wehrmacht had become a reflection of Hitler himself, sporadic, inflexible, and obsessed with control. Every battlefield disaster could be traced back to one root cause: the deliberate removal of military intelligence in favor of blind obedience. The purged command structure meant that Germany was effectively fighting with one eye closed. Hitler's refusal to tolerate dissent robbed the army of debate, experimentation, and adaptability, the very qualities that had once defined its success. Early in the war, the Wehrmacht's victories had come from officers who could think on their feet, who could exploit openings faster than the enemy could react. That freedom had been stripped away. Now every decision had to pass through a bottleneck of paranoia, ego, and ignorance at the top. The effect was visible everywhere. On the Eastern Front, entire armies were trapped and destroyed because no one dared authorize withdrawals. In France, Hitler's insistence on defending the coast to the last man during the Allied invasion made a flexible defense impossible. Even when local commanders identified opportunities to regroup or counterattack, they lacked the authority to act. Every decision waited for the Führer's approval, and by the time his orders came, the situation had already changed. The German war machine had once moved with precision and speed. Now it moved with the stiffness of a corpse. The Wehrmacht's collapse wasn't just the result of material shortages or overwhelming enemy strength. It was structural. The command system had been hollowed out from the inside. The professional officer corps, trained to analyze and adapt, had been replaced by flatterers and careerists whose main skill was survival. The new generation of commanders measured success not by victories, but by how well they could avoid Hitler's anger. The culture of initiative that had driven early successes in Poland and France was gone. In its place was a culture of fear, obedience, and paralysis. The damage extended beyond the battlefield. The loss of strategic thinkers like Guderian, Manstein, and Helder meant that Germany's war planning had no coherent direction. Hitler no longer had advisors who could see the bigger picture. He issued contradictory orders that made no logistical and simultaneous offensives in multiple directions. Demands for impossible production quotas and hold at all costs commands that guaranteed disaster. Without professionals to translate his delusions into feasible plans, the war effort dissolved into chaos. This chaos was compounded by the lack of coordination between the branches of the armed forces. The Army, Navy, and Air Force no longer operated under a unified strategic vision. Göring's Luftwaffe pursued vanity projects instead of practical air defense. The Navy wasted resources on symbolic submarine campaigns that accomplished nothing. The Army, forced into defensive warfare it was never designed for, fought alone and exhausted. Under Hitler's centralized leadership, every branch operated in isolation, competing for his approval rather than cooperating for victory. The irony was that Hitler's purges were intended to strengthen his control, but in reality, they destroyed it. The more he tried to command every aspect of the war, the less control he actually had. His refusal to delegate made him the bottleneck of every decision, and his increasing detachment from reality made those decisions catastrophic. The generals who remained loyal could see the collapse coming but were powerless to stop it. Their duty had been reduced to writing down his orders, watching them fail, and pretending they hadn't. By the last years of the war, the consequences of this self-inflicted wound were everywhere. In the East, the Red Army advanced relentlessly, exploiting German rigidity. The Soviets had learned to adapt. The Germans had forgotten how. In the West, the Allied invasion of Normandy was met with confusion and hesitation because Hitler refused to allow his panzer divisions to move until he personally gave the command orders too late. His obsession with control had made him the weakest link in his own chain of command, even when the disasters were undeniable. Hitler refused to acknowledge the connection between his purges and the army's failures. He continued to blame his generals for incompetence or betrayal, not realizing that the only incompetent left in the room was himself. He believed his intuition was infallible, that faith and will could substitute for fuel, ammunition, and manpower. The generals, who once could have corrected him, had been dismissed or executed. The ones who remained nodded in agreement as the country collapsed around them. The system he created became self-reinforcing. Every failure produced new purges, and every purge produced new failures. Hitler's distrust of professionals became prophecy. The more he removed capable men, the more mistakes were made, confirming his belief that no one but him could be trusted. By the final year of the war, he was commanding an army that existed only in theory, its divisions destroyed, its generals terrified, its soldiers dying in hopeless battles dictated by a man who had lost touch with reality. In many ways, the purge of the High Command was a mirror of Hitler's regime itself. It began with efficiency and ended with delusion. It replaced competence with loyalty, truth with ideology, and professionalism with fear. The same system that silenced political opponents now silenced military logic. The Wehrmacht, once feared for its precision and discipline, became a tragic example of what happens when obedience replaces reason. The Allies didn't have to defeat Hitler's generals. Hitler had already done that for them. His purge achieved what Allied bombs and Soviet offensives could not. It dismantled Germany's ability to fight a coordinated war. It wasn't just a tactical failure, it was a moral and intellectual collapse. The generals who might have negotiated a rational surrender, who might have saved millions of lives, had been sidelined long before. What remained was a hierarchy of fear, incapable of independent thought and paralyzed by the weight of one man's ego. By 1945, Hitler's headquarters had become a mausoleum of delusion. The maps on the walls still showed Germany as a world power, but the reality outside the bunker was ashes. When his generals tried to tell him the truth, that the fronts were gone, the armies destroyed, the nation doomed, he accused them of treachery. The man who had purged his command to eliminate doubt was now drowning in it. Every loyal voice that remained told him what he wanted to hear, right up until the moment the world collapsed around him. The purge of the military high command was not just a turning point in the war, it was the point of no return. It destroyed Germany's capacity for adaptation, erased its institutional memory, and ensured that defeat was not only possible but inevitable. Hitler's obsession with control had guaranteed chaos. His fear of betrayal had guaranteed failure. The Wehrmacht didn't lose because its soldiers stopped fighting. It lost because its leader stopped thinking. The tragedy of the purge is that it was entirely self-inflicted. No Allied deception, no secret weapon, no grand conspiracy brought down the German command structure. It was undone from within by arrogance, paranoia, and the need to be obeyed. The dictator who believed he could outthink his generals ended up outsmarting only himself. And as Berlin burned, the echoes of those lost voices, the strategists, the planners, the professionals hung in the air. Silent reminders of what might have been if reason had been allowed to speak. The final act of the war wasn't fought on the battlefield, but in the mind of a man who had already destroyed his own army. That was Hitler's true legacy, a self-inflicted wound so deep that it bled a nation dry.